Chapter 11, Melvins Fantasy. As Melvin set up the Combinatron 2000 and made the proper adjustments, he imagined what his life would be like as the world's first bionic boy. He imagined himself walking into school the next day, his arms swinging confidently as he crashed through the classroom wall. The girls would swoon as Melvin talked for hours about the amazing world of science. Miss Ribble would probably let Melvin sit at her desk from now on because Melvin's new buns of steel would be too massive to fit into an ordinary children's chair. Maybe Mr. Krupp would invite the governor to visit the school so he could show off his smartest and most powerful student. If so, the governor would probably declare a new holiday, National Melvin Sneedly Day, a day when kids all over the world would get extra homework and pop quizzes to honor the glorious name of Melvin. But the best part of all would be George and Harold's reaction. They would be so terrified by Melvin's incredible size and strength, they'd drop to their knees and beg for mercy. And Melvin would spare them only if they agreed to be his slaves for all eternity. They'd have to carry his books, sharpen his pencils, and be his personal footstools during each class. Life is gonna rule, said Melvin. Chapter 12, The Night of the Nasty Nostril Nuggets. Melvin turned on the Combinatron 2000. A high-pitched tone pierced the air, getting higher and higher in frequency as the machine charged to full power. Oops, said Melvin as he quickly turned the dramatic effect sounding to off so he wouldn't disturb his parents. Silently, the machine continued to charge as Melvin entered calculations to account for his clothes and glasses. When the laser extractor had finally warmed up, Melvin stepped in front of the Combinatron 2000, standing perfectly still beside his new robot. Suddenly, two streaks of red glowing light flashed onto Melvin and the robot as the Combinatron 2000 began assimilating information on the two elements it was about to combine. Finally, a computerized voice started the countdown. Combining two elements in 5 seconds. Melvin stood perfectly still. Combining two elements in 4 seconds. Melvin's nose began to twitch. Combining two elements in 3 seconds. Suddenly, Melvin felt an uncontrollable urge. He cupped his hands over his mouth and nose as his eyes squeezed closed involuntarily. Combining two elements in 2 seconds. Achoo! Achoo! Melvin looked down into his hands, which were now glistening with mucus and crusty chunks of semi-dried booglets. Instantly, the Combinatron 2000 began to recalculate the elements in its laser sights, combining 3 elements in 1 second. 3 elements! Melvin screamed in horror. What's the 3rd element? Quickly, Melvin's eyes darted around the room, searching for any new element that might have accidentally made its way into the sights of the laser extractor. What's the 3rd element? He screamed again. Then he looked down into his crusty, dripping, phlegm-filled hands. Uh-oh, said Melvin as a blinding burst of white light enveloped him. Blast! Chapter 13, The Next Day. The next day, Melvin didn't show up for school on time. Nobody really seemed to notice, though, because all the children were excited about show and tell. Almost everyone had brought in really lame stuff like books or awards, but George and Harold had something that was totally cool. Everybody remembers Sulu from yesterday, right? Said George. Well, we took him home to live with us in our tree house, and we taught him the greatest tricks, said Harold. The 2 boys carried Sulu over to the classroom window and opened it up. Harold pulled a large watermelon out of his book bag and showed it to Sulu. Okay, Sulu, said George, and to show everybody your new trick. In one swift motion, Sulu placed his mouth onto the watermelon and shoved the entire thing into his left cheek. The 4th graders were stunned. No, said Harold, that's not the trick. The trick is what happens next. Sulu looked out the window and eyed a dead tree at the far end of the empty playground. Sulu began to chew up the watermelon, then puckered his tiny hamster lips and spit. The watermelon seeds fired out of Sulu's mouth, hitting their target with expert precision. In no time at all, the dead tree at the end of the playground was reduced to a pile of twigs and sawdust. The class cheered as George and Harold petted their amazing little bionic buddy. George and Harold didn't think that anybody could beat their show-and-tell display, but they were wrong, because at that very moment, Melvin Sneedly was dripping down the hallway toward the classroom door. Melvin hadn't brought anything for show-and-tell. Melvin was the show-and-tell. Chapter 14, the unnecessarily disgusting chapter. Notice, the following chapter is extremely gross. To avoid nausea, projectile vomiting, or other gastrointestinal unpleasantries, please refrain from eating for at least 1 hour before reading this chapter. You won't want to eat after reading it, let me assure you. All of the 4th graders were cheering and petting Sulu as a classroom door slowly opened. A greenish, glistening behemoth entered the room, filling the air with the sounds of grinding metal gears and wet, gooey, bursting bubbles. Some of the girls screamed. Some of the boys did too. "You guys are so immature," said the horrible beast. At once, the children recognized the terrifying creature that stood before them. "Melvin?" they cried. "Yes, it's me," gurgled the wet, jiggling monster angrily. His eyes and nose were dripping with warm, greenish, custard-like mucus. His robotic arms were caked with massive globs of crispy, shimmering snot. And as he turned to close the bathroom door behind him, part of his hand came off on the doorknob. It oozed slowly down the door, leaving behind a chunky trail of moist excretion. Melvin squished and sloshed as he jiggled over to his chair. Each gooey footstep coated the floor with a foamy trail of slime, and everything he touched became wet and encrusted with warm, bubbling, syrupy phlegm. When Melvin sat down, generous helpings of greenish, pudding-like goo slowly dribbled down the chair, collecting into creamy, gelatinous puddles beneath him. The puddles themselves were slightly transparent and speckled with thick, shimmering nose hairs and dark red chunks of coagulated blood, which— "All right already!" yelled George the narrator. "Enough of the descriptions! You're making us all sick!" "Thank you, George," said Miss Ribble. "Now, Melvin, why don't you tell us all what happened to you?" "Well," said Melvin, "I tried to combine myself with a bionic robot last night, but I accidentally sneezed at the last second." "So you got combined with a robot and boogers?" asked George. "Yeah," said Melvin, "but don't worry, I'm building a Separatron 2000, which will reverse the effects and turn me back into a boy again. It'll just take 6 months to finish." "6 months?" said Harold. "Hey, cellular separation is a highly complex procedure," said Melvin. "It's not like building a robot. It takes time. You should try taking the batteries out of that combiner thingy and putting them in backwards," suggested George. "That might reverse the effect." Melvin rolled his thick, bubbling, crust-covered infrared eyeballs. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," he gurgled. Chapter 15, The New Melvin. You might think that turning into a bionic booger boy was the worst thing that could ever happen to a kid, but it wasn't all that bad. Believe it or not, there was actually a positive side to being a lumbering loogie lad. For instance, Melvin now won every football game he played because no one wanted to tackle him. And when he served a volleyball, nobody on the other team would dare to hit the ball back. Besides being the school's new sports star, there were other perks too. Melvin never had to wait in line at the drinking fountain anymore. Now he had his own personal drinking fountain because, well, would you use a drinking fountain after a bionic booger boy had globbered all over it? I didn't think so. All the special attention that Melvin was receiving made some of the other kids a little jealous. But not George and Harold. Considering the many evil villains that George and Harold had been battling all year, the two boys were just grateful that Melvin hadn't turned himself into a gigantic, terrifying beast with plans to destroy the earth. "It could be a lot worse," said Harold. "At least Melvin's not a terrifying evil villain." "Yeah, you're right," said George. "I can't think of anything that could turn Melvin into a terrifying evil villain." Chapter 16, The Cold and Flu Season. Soon it was autumn, and the new season brought with it many changes. Crisp, chilly air, early morning frost, and bright, colorful leaves. But with the beauty of autumn came another change that wasn't quite so welcome. The cold and flu season. All through Jerome Horwitz Elementary School, people were getting sick. The hallways were filled with runny noses, sneezing mouths, and aching bodies. Sniff, achoo! Sniff, sniff, sniff. Achoo! And unfortunately, one of those noses, mouths, and bodies belonged to Melvin Sneedley. Every time Melvin sneezed, thousands of tiny driblets shot out of his mouth, splattering the chalkboard with a thin layer of foamy, glistening, gunky green, tapioca-like mucus. "Don't forget to cover your mouth, Melvin, dear," said Miss Ribble. "Oh, sorry," said Melvin. "Sorry." He put his hand over his mouth and sneezed again. This time the explosion of air from his stifled sneeze blew off large wet globs of his body, which sprayed over the entire classroom. It was as if somebody set off a giant firecracker inside a bucket of green paint. The warm, smelly goo smacked onto people's hair, splattered onto their clothes, and seemed to drench every square inch of the room. On second thought, Melvin, said Miss Ribble, don't cover your mouth next time. Now, who wants a cookie? Chapter 17, The Field Trip. The next day, for some strange reason, Miss Ribble was out sick with a cold. Mr. Krupp was filling in as a substitute teacher and, as usual, he was very angry. What the heck is going on in this room? He yelled. What's with all the raincoats and umbrellas? Then Melvin sneezed. A few moments later, Mr. Krupp returned to the classroom with fresh clothes, a raincoat, and an umbrella. All right, everybody, he shouted. Today is field trip day. Miss Anthrop and I are all taking you to Snotty Brothers' tissue factory to see how blow rags are made. The word tissue made Melvin jump. No, he cried in a panic. Me no like tissues. An eerie silence fell over the classroom. Everybody looked at Melvin in shock. Did Melvin just say me no like tissues? Asked Harold. Yeah, said George. I never heard him misuse an objective pronoun before. Who does he think he is, Frankenstein? Chapter 18, Things Get Bad. In a few hours, the fourth graders were all packed into a hot, stinky factory listening to a boring speech about how trees are turned into tissues or something like that. Nobody was paying attention really except for Melvin Sneedley, who was terrified. His whole body shook and shimmered as the tour took them down the narrow walkways of the noisy industrial plant. Finally, the tour ended at the gift shop, where the plant manager, Mr. Snotty, had a surprise for everybody. Behind this red curtain with black dots on it, said Mr. Snotty, is a free gift for each of you. Mr. Snotty pulled back the curtain to reveal a pile of sample tissue packs. Help yourselves, said Mr. Snotty. There's enough for everybody. No, screamed Melvin. Me no like tissues. Oh, don't be silly, said Mr. Snotty. Everybody loves tissues, and our tissues are extra absorbent. They really help to wipe out phlegm and mucus. No, screamed Melvin again. Tissues is bad magic. Nonsense, laughed Mr. Snotty. He tossed a couple of sample tissue packs at Melvin. Here you go, young man, he said. Enjoy. The tissue packs flipped through the air and stuck onto Melvin's back. Melvin screamed. His eyes began to glow green as he beat his chest in anger. Suddenly, Melvin's shoulders started to bubble. His chest expanded. The flexor grew monic steel, and Melvin's endoskeleton flexed and grew. His neck and head widened, and his body swelled to a height of 13 feet. Melvin grabbed the tissue packs in his massive, dripping fingers and flung them to the ground. Don't make me angry, Melvin warned. You no like me when I angry. Oops, said Mr. Snotty. You dropped your tissue packs, young fellow. Here's some more for you. Mr. Snotty grabbed 2 giant handfuls of sample tissue packs and tossed them at Melvin. Chapter 19, Things Get Badder. Frantically, Melvin swatted at the 9 new tissue packs stuck to his upper torso as if they were a swarm of stinging bumblebees. He stomped his giant spiked feet and thrashed about violently as his hulking body doubled, then shriveled in size. Melvin kicked and punched the walls of the gift shop as he let out a terrifying, blood-curdling cry. There's no need to cry, little man, said Mr. Snotty. Here, have some more tissues to dry those tears. He tossed several more sample tissue packs at Melvin. As you might have noticed by now, Mr. Snotty wasn't exactly the brightest bulb on the Hanukkah tree. What happened next could only be described as chaos. Once again, Melvin's massive body tripled in size. By now, Melvin was roaring and kicking and knocking over giant machines. Children screamed and ran. Mr. Snotty thought it might help matters if he could just give Melvin more tissues. But before he could, a drop of mucus the size of a bathtub dripped from Melvin's massive nose and splashed down on Mr. Snotty, gluing him to the floor. Splat! George and Harold hid behind the red curtain with black dots on it as Melvin crashed through the roof of the factory. Ear-piercing roars bellowed out of his gigantic, oozing mouth as he kicked down the walls of the factory and tossed heavy machinery into the parking lot. Mr. Krupp and Miss Anthrop tried their best to get the situation under control, but they weren't having much luck. Hey, Bob, shouted Mr. Krupp. I've had just about enough of your shenanigans. You're going to be spending the afternoon in detention if you don't settle down, young man, shouted Miss Anthrop. Suddenly, Melvin reached down and grabbed Miss Anthrope in his massive metal fist. "Help me!" she screamed. "Somebody save me!" Said Mr. Krupp nervously. I'll go get some help." Mr. Krupp ran and hid with George and Harold behind the red curtain with black dots on it. "Hey, I thought you were going to go get some help," said Harold. "Well, not today," said Mr. Krupp. "You know," said George, "there's only one person who can help Miss Anthrope now." "Who's that?" asked Mr. Krupp. Chapter 20, Captain Underpants, that's who. As much as George and Harold hated to do it, they decided that it was time to send in Captain Underpants to save the day. George snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the terror and panic that Mr. Krupp had been experiencing completely vanished. Snap! A wild, silly grin spread across his face as he leaped to his feet and ripped off his outer clothing and toupee. Mr. Krupp's transformation into Captain Underpants was almost complete. The only thing he was missing was a cape. "Gee," he said, "I sure wish I could find a red curtain with black dots on it." "Hey," said George as he pointed to the red curtain with black dots on it. "Here's a red curtain with black dots on it." "What a remarkably unexpected coincidence," said Captain Underpants as he grabbed the latest in a series of convoluted plot devices and tied it around his neck. By this time, Melvin had stomped his way out of the factory and into the downtown area, leaving behind a twisted path of mucus-coated destruction. Captain Underpants flew into the air, following the trail of terror until he was face to face with the snot-spewing cyborg. "I order you to stop," said Captain Underpants, "in the name of all that is pre-shrunk and cottony." Melvin did not listen. Captain Underpants had no choice but to fight the boogery behemoth, but first he needed to save Miss Anthrope. Quickly, our hero flew to Edith's side, grabbed her hands, and pulled firmly. The slimy phlegm that covered Melvin's gigantic fist was strong and gluey, but it was no match for wedgie power. Captain Underpants pulled and pulled until Miss Anthrope became completely dislodged with a noisy, wet, disgusting sound. No, please feel free to make the noisy, wet, disgusting sound of your choice to emphasize the intense drama of this gripping paragraph. "I'm free!" cried Miss Anthrope. "Let's get the heck out of here!" Suddenly, the bionic booger boy reached down and grabbed Captain Underpants by the cape. The monster held on tightly with its giant, gooey, robotic fingers. "Ah!" cried Captain Underpants. "He's got my cape! He's got my cape!" "Well, just untie it!" screamed Miss Anthrope. "Let's go! Let's go!" "But I can't fight crime without my cape!" cried Captain Underpants. "Forget your stupid cape!" Edith screamed. "Just save me, you idiot!"